Major events of World War II. In this lecture, we'll address Virginia SOL US.2.7b. This is really the second part of US 2.7b that needs to be addressed. And in this lecture, we'll focus primarily on major events concerning the war. What were the major events and turning points of World War II? Make sure that you write down this question and then turn it into me when you get into class. First thing we're going to look at are the World War II alliances. Just a quick summary or overview of what they were. The Axis alliance consisted of Germany, Italy, and then Imperial Japan. And they were known as the Axis powers. And then we have the Allied powers. Now the Allied powers, there were three major powers, and then there were several other powers that, while not major, they were part of the Allies as well. The Allied forces consisted of well over 30 countries. And the Allies were made up of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. This and then other nations that came together and fought against the Axis. Now, the major turning points, what were they? Well, first off, in 1940 to 1941, Germany invaded Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, much of Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union. In Europe, only Great Britain remains free of German control, but they underwent heavy bombing during what was known as the Battle of Britain. Next major event, December 7th, 1941, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and this brings the United States into the war. There were actually some Japanese officers who had spent time in the United States and believed that this was a mistake, that the United States had a lot of untapped industrial power that would be unleashed on them should a war be started. But we know that it did happen, and part of the reason it happened was the Japanese were looking to keep the United States out of their way while they tried to attain resources to keep their empire moving, to keep it expanding. From October 1942 to May 1943, the Allies began to drive the Axis powers out of North Africa. You started first off with the British in northeastern Africa with American landings in northwestern Africa, and they begin to push the Italians and Germans closer and closer together into Tunisia, right up to the end where they meet. February 1943. German forces are weakened by the winter battle of Stalingrad, and they surrender to the Russians. This is a battle that had been going on for some time, and it was a battle that really highlighted some of the pitfalls of urban combat. The fighting for Stalingrad occurred street to street, and in some cases was even hand-to-hand combat. German troops, the German army had actually gotten overextended and then ultimately surrounded. Once their supplies were cut off, they were forced to surrender, and Germany basically lost the services of an entire army. There's further pictures illustrating what happened there at Stalingrad. In the lower right-hand corner, you actually have German prisoners of war, and they're walking back past what's actually a grain elevator that's been blown to pieces. June 4th, 1944, the Allies claimed victory over Italy. in really, at the time, Italy had not been defeated, but for the most part, since Mussolini's original government wasn't in place, really what was in place was a puppet government, and since the city of Rome had already been taken, it seemed as a good time to really declare victory there. So Allies claimed victory over Italy on June 4th, 1944. 2 days later, the Allies launch, Western Allies, Britain and the United States, launch the attacks on Normandy. On D-Day, the Allies launch a massive land and sea attack at Normandy in northern France. By August, France and the neighboring areas are free from Axis control, free from German control. So really in the matter of a couple of months, the Germans are essentially pushed out of much of the land that they had been occupying for the previous 4 years. April 1945, Germany faces attacks from both the Allied forces in the West, the British and the Americans, and the Allies in the East, the Soviet Union. They meet up, and you can see the picture here, kind of a symbolic meaning of soldiers from East and West, American soldiers shaking hands with Russian soldiers. Germany ultimately surrenders on May 7th, 1945, in what's known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. So Germany surrenders to the Allies. And then, as a result of 2 atomic bombs, Japan surrenders on August 14th, 1945, and then the surrender becomes official on September 2nd, 1945. So what happens then? Well, in Europe, not so much in the Pacific, but in Europe, the continent's divided. By the end of World War II, peace is brought to Europe, but the continent is divided between the Allied forces. In 1945, even before the war had ended, the Allied leaders met at the Yalta Conference to come up with a plan for dividing Germany into 2 parts, Western and Eastern, in order to weaken it. And these would be the occupied zones of Germany. The rest of Europe was left divided into generally democratic Western nations and then communist Eastern nations. And this divide, despite the fact that it had been at one point agreed that Europe would be divided, or that European countries that were liberated would have an opportunity to choose their governments for themselves. By the time the Potsdam Conference happens in July of 1945, it becomes clear that the Soviet Union isn't going to allow this to happen in the Eastern countries. So the boundary of this divide, eventually it becomes known as the Iron Curtain, which we'll talk more about once we get to the Cold War. And here you can actually see an image of occupied Germany, and then some of the concessions right here and here are actually portions that were, right here was a portion that was ceded over to Poland, and then the Soviet Union actually moves its border 100 miles eastward. Again, we'll get into this more when we get to the Cold War. So despite initial Axis success in both Europe and the Pacific, the Allies persevered and ultimately defeated Germany and Japan. That's all for this lecture. Make sure that you complete the assignment and turn it in to me as soon